Okay, this month, if I have a voice, this month, what we're reading is Essence of the Heart Sutra, a commentary on the Heart Sutra by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and published by Wisdom. I have a hardback version of it. It comes in paperback. I bought it in hardback because I knew I would beat it to death over the years. And this is a great commentary. This is actually, as you would expect from His Holiness, profound commentary on the Heart Sutra. But as my habit with these book talks, there's something else that I want to show you. This is another book. It's called Echoes of Voidness by Gishi Robten. And it's a commentary on the Heart Sutra also. Along with some other material, including some material on how to practice meditation. And here we go. This is what Gishi Robten looked like. He's deceased. Any of you know who Stephen Batchelor is? You know the name Stephen Batchelor? So
Yes, definitely.
Gishi Robten was one of Stephen's main teachers early on. He was the main teacher at a Tibetan center in Switzerland. And I feel a special affinity for him because the first time I traveled to India and I went up to Dharamsala, I found myself at the beginning of my journey in a second-class air-conditioned railroad second-class AC train compartment with 3 other men, one of whom was a colonel in the Indian Air Force, and the other 2 were Gishi Robten and his attendant. I had no idea who he was at the time. Later on, I found out that according to rumor in Dharamsala, he was reputed to have realized emptiness directly. That's an extraordinary attainment, that he'd had a direct realization of emptiness. So I mention this because that's what he's writing from. His commentary is from his own experience. So it's well worth referring to Echoes of Voidness by Gishi Robten. But I'm not going to refer to it in this class more than that, except to say that it's a great commentary and it's informed my way of thinking about this material. And I'm sure you can find a used copy someplace. It's probably out of print, but it'd be a great addition to anybody's library. So back to the book at hand, Essence of the Heart Sutra. And the translator and editor of this book is Geshe Tubten Jinpa. So, I mean, you can hardly ask for a better combination than the Dalai Lama giving the commentary on the Heart Sutra and having it translated and edited by Tubten Jinpa, who's a master at doing these sorts of things. So I also have to confess that I'm a little bit intimidated to be trying to teach on this material, given this illustrious history of commentators on this. But I'll do my best to go to several passages that I think are particularly interesting. And we can talk about them. I guess a little bit of an introduction to the Heart Sutra is in order. I don't know whether everybody here is familiar with it, or people who may be watching this recording, whether or not they may be familiar with it. So Heart Sutra is a very, very short text, and it's often recited at the beginning of teachings. And it's considered I don't know if I want to say one of the holiest of Buddhist scriptures in the Mahayana tradition, but it's one that's most frequently recited at the beginning of teachings. So one thing that I've noticed is that when His Holiness is doing these Zoom teachings now from Dharamsala, which he's been doing a lot of during the COVID pandemic, he'll have either sponsors or groups of people in the audience from Taiwan and Singapore and various other locations in Asia, Vietnam, perhaps. And he'll he'll start the teachings with a recitation of the Heart Sutra, but he very frequently asks people to recite the Heart Sutra in their native language. So if they're a group of nuns, say, from China, he'll have the Heart Sutra recited in Chinese, and then perhaps recited in Vietnamese, and this sort of thing, as a way of perhaps reminding us that this scripture is very important to Mahayana Buddhists all over the world, because it is. It's very important. And traditionally speaking, it's a teaching that takes place on Vulture Peak in India, which is just outside of Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha was enlightened. Not a very far drive. I was very fortunate to be able to visit Vulture Peak with my teacher Taratilku and actually practice there, which is something many people do. And it was really a very extraordinary experience. It's a very holy place. In my own case, well, I won't go into that, never mind. There's no point. But anyway, so this teaching takes place there with the Buddha, Shariputra, Avalokiteshvara are with him, plus a number of other monks and nuns, bodhisattvas, and non-human beings who are floating in the air around Vulture Peak. And I assume they're floating in the air because the physical space that people can sit in maybe would accommodate 20 people or 25 people. And apparently there's a much larger audience for this particular event. So I assume that this larger audience was floating in the air around Vulture Peak because there wouldn't have been enough space for them to sit on Vulture Peak. But one of the things that's unusual about this sutra, and I'll talk more about what the Perfection of Wisdom sutras are. One of the things that's unusual about it is that it's not a teaching that the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, gives directly. There's a gathering and he sits down and Shakyamuni enters into a certain stage of meditation, certain state of meditation. And then Shariputra asks Avalokiteshvara a question. So we're talking about the human Avalokiteshvara here. We're not talking about the transcendental Avalokiteshvara. And then Avalokiteshvara responds to that question. And essentially the sutra is Avalokiteshvara teaching. And then at the end of the sutra, the Buddha comes out of his meditative state and he says, "Very well done. That's just exactly right, Avalokiteshvara. You got it right." And that's beginning and end of this particular sutra. So that's a little bit unusual for sutra, right? I mean, usually the Buddha teaches the sutras. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. I mean, if you want to, you can read it yourself. I don't see a virtue to doing that right now. But I want to jump to page 53. And because of the experience that we've had with these Zoom recordings, I'm not going to put the text up, but I'm going to read it, because sometimes these recordings get shrunk to the point where nobody could possibly see a text. once the recording got stretched into a version of CinemaScope, and it would have made it impossible to read the text, although it was rectified later. So let me read these comments by His Holiness. And the beginning of the book, he does sort of a general discourse on the Dharma and the place of the perfection of wisdom sutras in the Dharma. And so this is an extract from that, and I'm going to read the whole thing. It's a paragraph long, so I won't, it won't be too much to endure my reading, but it's the place where I want to start. This is His Holiness saying, as I have said, the first turning of the Wheel of Dharma lays down the basic structure of the Buddhist path to enlightenment within the framework of the Four Noble Truths. That's the first turning of the Wheel of Dharma. I'll come back to what this means. The second turning of the wheel, comprised principally of the perfection of wisdom texts, further elaborates on the third noble truth, the truth of cessation, particularly in terms of understanding the ultimate nature of reality, emptiness. As one's understanding of the ultimate nature of reality deepens, one begins to recognize more clearly the erroneous nature of one's belief in intrinsic existence. As the erroneous nature of this belief becomes increasingly evident, one's insight into the true nature of reality becomes deeper and clearer. In this way, we also lay a foundation for the deeper understanding of the subjective experience of emptiness, which is the key theme in the third turning of the Wheel of Dharma. The principal scriptures of the third turning are the Buddha Nature Sutra, which is the basis of Maitreya's sublime continuum, and Nagarjuna's collection of hymns. These scriptures present in great detail the teachings of Buddha nature and the nature of the subjective experience of emptiness, and thereby lay the foundations for the Vajrayana or Tantra teachings. So the reason that I read this passage is what His Holiness has done here in describing the three turnings of the wheel is pull together a lot of disparate, apparently disparate teachings that one may have run into to see them in a certain kind of context. Okay, so let me be even more specific about this. So in the last several months, I've done 3 series of teachings. This is the fourth. The first one was called, I think, The Psychology of Buddhist Tantra. And then I started doing these book talks. The first one was on making life meaningful. Then last month, I did one on the 3 principal aspects of the path. And so I want to use these to pull all those things together, because at least in my own mind, there's been a continuum. These things have all fit together, but it may not be apparent to anybody else. Okay. So the series of talks that I did on the psychology of Buddhist Tantra, I emphasized the way in which the states of waking consciousness, dreaming consciousness, and dreamless sleep consciousness are similitudes for the 3 bodies of a Buddha: Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya. I'm not going to repeat this, but this kind of psychology is based on what's here described as the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma. Okay. The three principal aspects of the path, I emphasized renunciation and talked about renunciation. And the framework in which I talked about it was the beginning of the 12 links of dependent origination, the way in which ignorance leads to grasping, and then all the following links and all the suffering that comes from that, and talked about overestimation and underestimation. That teaching essentially is a teaching of the first turning of the Wheel of Dharma. It comes out of the Abhidharma, which is a psychology, a systematic psychology, which was extracted by the old Buddhist masters from the Suture teachings of the Buddha. Okay. And so we'll run into those things again here in the Heart Sutra. For example, when Avalokiteshvara says form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is not different from emptiness, emptiness is not different from form. When he's talking about form, he's talking about the skandha of form. And so the five skandhas teaching are basic Abhidharma teachings, right? So that's the first wheel of the Dharma. And when I was talking about practices that Lama Zopa Rinpoche presents in making life meaningful, when he talks about walking with bodhicitta, eating with bodhicitta, and I use those kinds of examples for understanding dependent origination. That's actually in the second turning of the Wheel of Dharma, because those are ways of understanding emptiness teachings. And then that was further elaborated on in the three principal aspects of the path. Okay. So I mentioned this by way of creating some sort of context for what's been going on in these classes. Now, this idea of turning the Wheel of Dharma is very interesting. When the Buddha first taught his former colleagues and later disciples in Sarnath after his enlightenment, his very first teaching, which was on the Four Noble Truths, traditionally said it was on the Four Noble Truths. It was called Turning the Wheel of the Dharma. You know, in the ancient way of thinking about things, the Buddha had set something in motion with his teachings. Well, what he set in motion is something, an energy, a teaching that's lasted for 2,500 years. It's going on right now. Here we are sitting and talking about the Buddha's teaching. But the image that they had was he was turning a wheel. And that's kind of interesting. What does that mean, turning a wheel? You know, actually, a wheel at the time of the Buddha was sort of an advanced technology. I mean, we don't think of it that way, but it was an advanced technology. So there was some energy, if you will, that was released in turning the wheel. But one of the things that I think about with a wheel is a wheel has spokes. I mean, the traditional Buddhist imagery of the Wheel of Dharma is an 8-spoked wheel. Now, all the spokes connect to each other, right? So the image here is all the aspects of the teaching connect to all the aspects of the teaching. So you can't really talk about one aspect of the teaching without having some implication for other aspects of the teaching, right? So you can't talk about Madhyamaka without talking about Abhidharma. They get implied in each other, right? You can't talk about Vajrayana without talking about the underlying foundations and the things that are implied in the Vajrayana teachings. So that was partly what I was also trying to illustrate in reflecting back on some of the classes that I've been doing in these series of talks. Everything connects with everything else in this Dharma wheel. And the other thing, though, from the point of view of being a student of the Dharma, is the way to understand anything is to understand the way in which it connects to everything else in the Dharma. So that becomes very difficult, because when you first enter an understanding of the Dharma, and we're all really beginners. I'm a beginner too. When you start understanding or trying to understand the Dharma, it becomes complicated in the sense that to try and understand one thing, you immediately begin to realize you need to understand something else. And you begin to feel like very easily you're in over your head. I'm seeing smiles and shaking heads because we've all had that experience. Like, oh, okay, now we're talking about form as emptiness, emptiness and form. Holy cow. I mean, here, emptiness teachings, how complicated are those? And then we got the 5 skandhas. I mean, okay, now how's my understanding of the skandhas? It's like, oh, it's like, I don't know, it's like sticky tar. You touch one thing and then, something else sticks to you like this, and it kind of goes on. I mean, it's good sticky tar. It's not bad sticky tar. Maybe I should say it's sort of like sticky rice. That's better, because we had sticky rice for dinner, which I, by the way, managed to drop on the floor. So that was the excitement for the evening, picking that up. But in sticky rice, every grain sticks to every other grain. You can't really separate them very easily from each other. Okay. So the Dharma is like sticky rice, but the image is this wheel with the 8 spokes, right? But here we have 3 wheels, and what they represent is different perspectives on the truth, but they implicate each other in interesting ways. Okay, so the Heart Sutra is something that comes out of the second turning of the wheel. But I'm going to jump to some passages here which imply some other things, some other sticky points. Because tonight I'm not going to really talk about the Heart Sutra as such directly. I'm really into the preliminary commentary that's given by His Holiness. But I really want to make a transition between tonight and some other things that have happened. If you were to jump to page 69 in this text, which is a section titled The Origin of Teachings, a commentary that His Holiness makes at this point. Well, let me actually read the section, the first section of the Heart Sutra, which this is a commentary on. So the sutra begins this way. Thus have I once heard. The Blessed One was staying in Rajgriha at Vulture Peak, along with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. And at that time, the Blessed One entered the meditative absorption on the varieties of phenomena called the appearance of the profound. So the Buddha goes into this meditative state called the appearance of the profound. And so His Holiness is commenting on that. And this is what he has to say. This is what he has to say about the state of the mind of the Buddha at this point, at the very beginning of the sutra. And it's worth thinking about the fact that when Shakyamuni is in this state of mind, this meditative state, it's having an effect on all the other monks. In this case, it's only monks and transcendental beings that are around him. They're being influenced by his state of mind, right? It's not like he's isolated, but he's radiating an energy which is impacting the minds of everybody else. So His Holiness wants to talk about that. And this is what he says. The Bhagavan has totally transcended all such obstructive forces. The obstructive forces are the afflictions, various afflictions that we're all subject to. He's transcended all such obstructive forces and is free from all the effects and limitations caused by these obstructive forces. All the factors obscuring true vision have been removed. We say that the obstructions are removed rather than that a new kind of vision is attained. Because cognition, and that means our cognition, not just his, because cognition has the natural capacity to understand or to know. And once there are no longer obstructive forces impeding its full function, the natural capacity to know becomes fully apparent. Okay. Once the obstructions are removed, our natural wisdom emerges. It's not like we have to create wisdom. It's there already. We have to uncover it. This state of clarity is the all-knowing state, the omniscient mind. In fact, one of the principal characteristics of the Buddha's omniscient mind is that it perceives both the relative and ultimate truths simultaneously within a single cognitive event. Whereas, although beings who are not fully awakened may have some insight into the ultimate and relative, they must shift between the two perspectives. Okay, so I want to reflect back on some things we've been talking about over the weeks. Back to this paragraph, this sentence. We say that the obstructions are removed rather than a new kind of vision is attained. What does that mean, the obstructions have been removed? Remember when I was talking about the Zen monastery, the fifth and sixth patriarchs in the Zen monastery, and the head student's poem was to wipe the dust from the mirror, continuously wipe the dust from the mirror. That was the way he understood meditative practice. And then the mirror could clearly reflect what is the truth, right? So when His Holiness says obstructions are removed, that's what he's talking about. It's like wiping the dust from the mirror. Obstructions are removed. It's the same thing, okay? But then he goes on to say that the Buddha's omniscient mind perceives both the relative and the ultimate truth simultaneously within the single cognition, the single cognitive event. Okay. Let me screen share something. Okay, this is back to the three principal aspects of the path, which we were talking about last month. The 11th stanza. You've yet to realize the thought of the able, which means the Buddhas, as long as two ideas seem to you disparate. The appearance of things, infallible interdependence, and emptiness, beyond taking any position. These are the two truths. The appearance of things is the conventional truth of things, and emptiness is the ultimate truth of things. When those two things seem to you to be disparate, other than each other, you haven't realized the status of a Buddha mind. Tsongkhapa goes on and says, at some point they no longer alternate, come together. Just seeing that interdependence never fails brings realization that destroys how you hold to objects, and then your analysis with you is complete. But here's the key point. At some point, your experience of the two truths no longer alternate. And here His Holiness is saying This is what is the nature of the Buddha's mind. It perceives both the relative and the ultimate truth simultaneously within a single cognitive event. So that's what Tsongkhapa is talking about. The same thing this His Holiness is talking about here. This is the state of mind the Buddha was in, presumably, when this sutra is being taught by Avalokiteshvara. Okay. So let's stop screen sharing. So again, what I wanted to do here is I wanted to relate where we are in these teachings to what's been coming, what was in the past, what we taught in the past. Like the wheel with the spokes that interconnect. I'm going to try and connect everything. Okay. We have to shift between the two perspectives in our own practice. And that's, as Tsongkhapa was saying, we haven't gotten there yet, but we have to go back and forth between ultimate and relative truths. Although, from my point of view, if any of us could experience the ultimate nature of things, even briefly, that would be remarkable, wouldn't it? You know. So, what states of mind are we talking about here? They're pretty extraordinary. So let me stop for a moment. Are there questions at this point about how this stuff connects and why I'm doing this? Okay. All right. Well, you know, professors do this sort of stuff. This is the way we teach. Colin's smiling. He gets too much of it. All right. Okay, so this is called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So what is it that's meant by wisdom? So on page 78, His Holiness defines this. In the Heart Sutra, as the sutra goes on, the next stanza is, at that time as well, the noble Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the great being, clearly beheld the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom itself, and saw that even the five aggregates are empty of intrinsic existence. Okay, so this is the second stanza. This is a brief comment that His Holiness makes on this. He says, he saw that even the five aggregates are empty of intrinsic existence. That's in the sutra. Then His Holiness says, this then is the meaning of practicing the perfection of wisdom. Okay. Perfect wisdom is seeing with clarity that even the five skandhas are empty. He goes on in the sutra. Avalokiteshvara goes on in the sutra, talk about everything that's empty. But here at the very beginning, he says, the five aggregates are empty of intrinsic existence, or empty of inherent existence is another way of translating it. Okay. So this is what wisdom is. Wisdom is seeing the empty nature of the five aggregates. So what are the five aggregates? I mean, five aggregates are a traditional way in which the Dharma describes what is a human being. Now, my sense has always been that, well, I have this image of the Buddha teaching his disciples and saying, look, this is what a human being is. A human being is composed of these five categories with nothing left over. Okay. So for example, human beings have physical bodies. That's what's meant by form. I mean, technically the Sanskrit would be rupa. It just refers to anything that has form. So it could refer to the physical world, the forms of the physical world. But in this case, it relates to the fact that one has a material body, material form, you know. So he puts down a stone on the ground and he says, see, okay, now we talked about this one. He says, human beings also have feelings. We're attracted to things, we're repelled by things, or we're neutral. He says, so here's another pile over here, 3 stones, attraction, neutrality, repulsion. This is 3 more aggregates. By the way, do you remember my teaching about overestimation and underestimation? That overestimation, it was my teaching, this is Genla's teaching, that overestimation was seeing things as if they're more than what they really are because we don't see their real nature, so we're attracted to them. Underestimation is not seeing things for what they are, underestimating their actual nature, not seeing them as being adequate in some way. So that creates hostility and we reject them. And that, by the way, leads to hatred too. So those are the 3 feelings, if you will. And then there's perception. We perceive things, and he says the perception is based upon sense organs. And he says, so there's visual perception, put some stones down, auditory perception, tactile perception, olfactory perception, gustatory, tongue perception. And then there's the one that tends to throw people, which is the 6th one, which is mental perception, mind sense, which is non-physical. And we'll get into that more, of course, later. All right. Then there's habit patterns. So that's another group of experiences. There's the impulses that drive us based upon habit patterns, former karma, the way our attention works, and this sort of thing. And then finally, the 5th skandha is just consciousness. And then the Buddha says, so among those 5 skandhas, where's the person? So the person is all of those 5 skandhas. But there is no special something called an I. And of course, he was teaching in the context of a world in which people believed that there was something like a soul over and above whatever was given in experience. That the sense of I was permanent, that was like a possessor of the body and mind. But the Buddha says, if you really look at your experience, all you find is the 5 aggregates, the parts of the 5 aggregates. And you find this notion of I, the sense of I, but you don't find any permanent entity in there that's an I. So this is basic Buddhist teachings. And the Heart Sutra does talk about these things. And the way the Heart Sutra talks about them is to say, he, Avalokiteshvara, saw that even the 5 aggregates are empty of intrinsic existence. This then is the meaning of practicing the perfection of wisdom. So this is going to be the focus of what we talk about over the next few weeks. What does that mean to perceive the empty nature of phenomena? And I hope we can do that, because it gets subtle. It gets difficult to do that, but that's what the perfection of wisdom is. So that's where we'll be going. But before we get there, there's one other passage that I want to read, that I want to come back to, again, for some more context. And this is on page 101 of the text. Again, this is still His Holiness's commentary. And here he's talking about the process of perception. He's talking about it in the context of the mind-only interpretation. So here we're at the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma and the foundation for understanding Vajrayana or tantric practice. His Holiness says, as we have discussed earlier, all sensory experiences of the external world arise through the coalescence of three factors: a sensory faculty, an object, and our mental perception. And here he was referring to consciousness. So here we're talking about the perception aggregate, essentially, among the five aggregates. This perception of an external object then gives rise to a subjective evaluation. We find an object either attractive or unattractive. Okay, so now he's talking about overestimation and underestimation of the object perception. We then project desirable or undesirability onto the object, feeling the quality to be an objective reality inherent in the object. An objective quality to be inherent in the object. So this is the essence of ignorance, avidya, or delusion. And the practice, the wisdom of seeing emptiness is to unravel this, to recognize that what we're doing is we're projecting qualities upon objects that are not inherent or natural to the object. On the basis of this projection, we may then develop a strong emotional reaction. If the object is seen as undesirable, we feel distaste or revulsion. If the object is seen as desirable, we feel attraction or desire. So where does this lead? It leads to obscuring the natural nature of the mind. It leads to obscuring the clarity of the mind. So the whole focus of the practice of the perfection of wisdom is, on the one hand, seeing this process, which is outlined in the Abhidharma, and then on the other hand, seeing that what we're experiencing in the objects around us is our own projection. Now, in the sutra, it is said, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is not different than emptiness. Emptiness is not different than form. When we go back to the actual sutra itself, then read this passage. Avalokiteshvara says, Shariputra, any noble son or daughter, and by the way, His Holiness does a whole riff on what that means, noble son or daughter of the lineage. And his explanation is not that you have good parents, or not that you are sort of an upper class person, but rather that you've realized something about Buddha nature. And that's what makes you a noble son or daughter. Any noble son or daughter who so wishes to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom should clearly see this way. They should see perfectly that even the five aggregates are empty of inherent existence. He says, empty of intrinsic existence. I'm sorry, I used to translate all these as inherent existence. It's just a habit. Empty of intrinsic existence. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form too is not other than emptiness. Okay. But here's the point that I want to make at this time. Likewise, feelings, the next aggregate, perceptions, the next aggregate, mental formations, which I call habits, the next aggregate, and consciousness are all empty. Therefore, Shariputra, all phenomena are emptiness. It's one thing to be able to be thinking about, or to try and think about, the emptiness of form, the emptiness of the things that are around us. That's difficult enough. But what's really profound is to try and think about and meditate on the emptiness of consciousness. Because that's very tricky. That's very tricky. We feel like our minds, our consciousnesses, or our consciousness, that which we hold most dearly, is something solid, something continuous, something that somehow never changes. Our awareness always feels like it just is what it is, right? But by the Buddhist analysis, this is really not true at all. This is a huge delusion, a huge illusion. Now, one of the things that Gishi Robten talks about in Echoes of Voidness is how to begin to practice looking at the emptiness of consciousness, looking at the empty nature of that particular aggregate. And he talks about how to do it, even though it's incredibly difficult. Why is it so difficult to begin to understand the empty nature of consciousness? Well, first off, we need to have an understanding of what emptiness means. Okay. Then we need to apply it to an extremely subtle phenomenon. It's actually hard to find the mind. As is always pointed out, the mind has no shape, it has no color, it has no texture. Consciousness has no defining characteristics, really, except it appears to know, to cognize, right? When you feel like you know something, like, I know I'm hearing sounds, that sense of knowing is one of the characteristics of consciousness, one of the characteristics of mind. I'll use those two terms interchangeably at the moment. But it's very hard to keep your attention focused on what that is and to find it. It's actually very hard to find the mind and keep our attention pinned on it. We think we can do it, but actually we don't do it very well. Let me be a little bit more specific. As His Holiness was saying earlier, in any given moment of perception, three things come together. And remember, there's 6 kinds of perfection, one of which is, 6 kinds of perception. Well, there are 6 perfections, right? But that's not what I meant to talk about. 6 kinds of perceptions, right? One of which is the mental perception, which is non-physical. But 3 things still need to come together for every kind of perception. There has to be an object, there has to be an organ of perception, like an eye or a mind, and then there has to be the consciousness that's associated with that. Now, we don't tend to experience things in that way on a moment-by-moment basis, right? When you're listening to me, you just hear sound, right? You're not really very cognizant of the fact that there's awareness, there's your ear, and there's sound vibrations or vibrations in the air which are coming into your ear. And that's what's going on when we hear, right? We just hear. So what's happening in those moments is our consciousness is thoroughly mixed with the object of consciousness. And it's actually pretty hard to separate them from each other. I mean, we can say I'm conscious of what I'm looking at, but to actually find that consciousness is really difficult, because how do you separate the consciousness from what you're conscious of? I mean, you can try this as an experiment, right? When you do it, you're probably going to notice that you're aware, you're cognizing, you're thinking about the problem. And you're thinking, okay, I'm aware of the fact that there's an object of vision, and that there's an awareness of that object, that I am aware of that object. But it's very difficult to separate out the actual awareness from the object. When you try and do it, what seems to happen is basically you're having thoughts about it rather than a direct experience of it. I mean, you can practice this after we finish this session. It's worth practicing it. It's worth trying to do it, okay? It's not that it's impossible to do, it's difficult to do, because it's very difficult to isolate consciousness in and of itself, right? It becomes even more difficult if you try and do it in regards to mental consciousness. But here's the thing. The ability to focus attention on mental consciousness without an object, right? To get at the consciousness itself that is folded into the experience of the object of consciousness is really like the royal road to freedom. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but when we were talking about Lama Yeshe's commentary on the three principal aspects of the path, he talked about a meditative practice, which seemed deceptively simple at the time. Right? He said, try and pay attention to your mind, to your consciousness, and what will happen is thoughts will arise and distract you. When that happens, notice that the thoughts have arisen, and then let them go, and go back to trying to pay attention to the pure, luminous, aware nature of your consciousness. And then immediately more thoughts will come up and distract you. Let them go and go back, if you can, to the pure nature of your own awareness. Now, in that case, he's talking about going back to mental awareness of the object of mental awareness. Like, because you're thinking, okay, I'm going to pay attention to my own consciousness. So those two things are coming together. Okay. But that's sort of like the basal practice. Okay. So this is the royal road to finding one's way into the essential nature of what one is, and getting at what His Holiness is also called the Buddha nature in this part of the commentary. When he was talking about the three turnings of the wheel, let's see if I can find this. Talks about the Buddha nature and the nature of the subjective experience of emptiness. seeing the empty nature of one's own consciousness, of one's own awareness. And one begins to practice that through this process of letting the thoughts go and returning attention to the process of awareness to the extent that one's able to do this. Okay. So this is the practice of the perfection of wisdom in regards to one's own awareness. And as His Holiness has said, at least in one other place, this is the practice that produces the greatest, most successful outcome. This is the profound practice that leads to the greatest degree of freedom, of liberation. Okay. This is the perfection. This is the practice, the perfection of the wisdom about one's own awareness. Okay. So that's what I wanted to say this evening by way of introducing the Heart Sutra. And we'll look at this some more as the weeks go on. We'll talk about more about what means emptiness, which I'm sure you've heard plenty of, but we'll get more of it because it's the subject of this month's material. So that's what I have to say for the time being. If anyone has questions or comments or whatever, please feel free to jump in with them and I'll try to answer your questions. If not, then I'll see you next week. Where are we at?
Hi, David.
Yeah, Mary.
Can you, this is a great teaching. Thank you so much. Can you repeat the 6 kinds of perceptions?
Sure. They refer to the 6 sense organs. So there's visual perception. And for visual perception to occur, 3 things have to come together. There has to be an eye organ, an eyeball, a functioning eye organ. There have to be objects. And then there has to be consciousness. When those 3 things come together, you have a visual perception. Perhaps a way to understand this is to go to Carlsbad Caverns. And when they turn out the lights, you can't see anything. I mean, we never experienced true darkness. You go to Carlsbad Caverns and they turn out the lights, you experience true darkness. And you can't have a visual perception. What happens is you get some visual noise in your eye organ, but you can't see anything. So it's impossible to have a visual perception. It's like being asleep in a certain way because the eye sense can't function because it doesn't have an object. Okay. Second form of perception is hearing. So you have to have the ear organ, ear consciousness, and sounds. Sounds, well, that's not the best way to phrase it. You have to have vibrations in the air, right? And the ear, and you have to have an ear, and then you have ear consciousness. So that's auditory perception. So there are 3 factors there. Okay. Then there's smell. It's the same thing, right? Your nose has to be functioning. There has to be something to smell. And then there has to be the consciousness of smelling. Same thing for tasting. Although interestingly, I think we often get taste and smell confused in our experience. But, you have to have a tongue. There has to be something that the tongue is engaged with, like food or something like that. And then consciousness. And then there's touch. So your entire body is a sense organ for touch. Obviously your skin, but you can feel things in your muscles. You can feel things in your internal organs, right? That's often pleasant, like a full stomach, that's pleasant. Or you've eaten something that you shouldn't have eaten, that's unpleasant. but there's sense, your stomach is a sense organ in that respect, right? So there's the body, which is a sense organ. There's whatever the body is engaged with. And then there's the consciousness. Now, where it's difficult is with the sixth SIXTH sense organ, which is called mental consciousness. Right? But it's particularly interesting because the object of mental consciousness are things like thoughts, also the experiences of the five physical sense organs are the object of mental consciousness, right? So you hear the sound, which is my voice, but you hear not just sound, you hear words, and the words have meaning, right? It's the mental consciousness that makes the meaning, right? If I just, there's no meaning there, that's a sound without meaning, right? So that's just pure auditory consciousness. But my voice is auditory consciousness and mental consciousness coming together. That's the object of mental consciousness. Now, what's complicated then is you ask, so what's the organ of consciousness? What's the organ of mental consciousness? We might want to say the brain. I mean, the ancient Buddhists didn't know what a brain is. And this is actually the subject of some very interesting research and dispute at the moment, I would say. If you're a materialist scientist in the West, you'd say that the organ of mental consciousness is the brain. But if you're a Buddhist, you'd say that the organ of mental consciousness is the previous moment of consciousness. This is the traditional way in which the Buddhists describe the organ of consciousness. It's the previous moment in the stream of consciousness, is the organ which knows the objects of consciousness. Hopefully you don't want me to go down the path of what does that mean. Mary's shaking her head no. Thank you for letting me off the hook. I appreciate that. Okay, so these are sometimes called the 12 ayatanas. No, the 18 ayatanas, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm getting, you don't need to know that. Forget about it. Anyhow, they're the 18 elements of the skandha of perception. Okay. Good. Anything else? No. That's good. There's a finger pointing at. Who are you pointing at?
Jay has a question.
My hand
Jay
up.
Andres.
Oh, who has her hand up? I'm sorry, I can't see that.
It's Jay over in South Australia.
Oh, Jay. Okay. Yeah, for some
Okay.
reason, yeah, I didn't get that. Yeah, what's up?
Okay. So what I can do sometimes if I put my attention on it and I have mixed feelings about how helpful it is, I can willfully just not think. It doesn't last very long at all. We're talking milliseconds probably, but I can use my will to just say, okay, I'm not going to think, boom. And then shortly things come in. Is that what we're going for? Is that ability on a prolonged basis? Or, I've read something or heard something where I kind of worry, well, does that mean I'm just kind of doing the prelude to unconsciousness? And that's not really what we're going for. Is that clear?
Yeah, it is clear. What you're talking about is an attempt to practice mental quiescence or shamatha. You've heard the term shamatha?
Yes, definitely. Shamatha and Vipassana, I know those terms.
Right. So shamatha means a relaxed, single-pointed settling of attention. So attention rests on one thing and is not distracted by anything else. So here what you're, I think, describing is an attempt to practice shamatha on the clear nature of mind itself, because you're trying to settle your attention on your own awareness, on your own mind, on the clarity of your own mind. This is, in fact, the practice that Lama Yeshe was talking about in a passage that I quoted from the Principal Teachings of Buddhism. Is that what the book was called? No, The Essence of Tibetan Buddhism. It's on the three principal aspects of the path, but the book is called The Essence of Tibetan Buddhism. He talks about doing this practice, about, thoughts come up, you let the thoughts go, and you try and focus your attention on the clear nature of awareness itself. That sounds like that's what you're trying to do, isn't it, Jai?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know what you're talking about. It's almost as though there's no object at all.
Right.
I'm just kind of consciously making a choice to go quiet.
Yeah, exactly so.
And I worry that just means I'm going unconscious and it's a waste of time. Yeah.
But you're not going unconscious, because you're being conscious of consciousness. So how can you be unconscious? If you fell asleep, you'd be unconscious.
Yep. Okay. And like I said, it's very brief, because then thoughts really rush in. Yeah.
I know it's a very difficult practice.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's shamatha. It sounds to me like what you're doing is trying to develop shamatha, which is actually essential Buddhist practice.
Okay.
Unconsciousness is a very interesting notion. Do you want me to talk about that for just a minute?
Good for me.
Yeah. Okay. I see a thumb up from Lou. Okay. So there is no Buddhist concept of unconsciousness. Isn't that interesting? There is no Buddhist concept of unconsciousness. See, when I've always felt like one of the ways in which we know that we're conscious is we fall asleep and it's dark. We wake up and the sun is out and the birds are chirping. And we say, oh, I was asleep. Right? But I didn't know anything while I was asleep. Well, except for your dreams, of course, but not counting your dreams. I didn't know anything, and all this time has passed. So I guess I was unconscious. I was asleep because all this time was past. But actually, the research, even Western research, is that people don't know they're asleep when they're asleep. They only know it by inference when they wake up. And a lot of times people fall asleep and you wake them up in a sleep lab and they'll say, no, I was not asleep. It happens to me all the time. I'll be laying in bed and I'll be awake and I'll think, gee, I could use some more sleep. And but I'm not going to get any more sleep. And like maybe it's 4 a.m, so it's dark outside. And then suddenly I feel like, geez, I've been laying here for the longest time. But if I look at the clock, wow, it's 5:30. Didn't feel like I was laying here for an hour and a half. That's because I was asleep, but I didn't even know it. Okay. Because the nature of being asleep is we don't notice what's going on. This is what we tell ourselves anyway. This is the Western view. So we say that we were unconscious. What's really interesting is the Buddhist view is quite different. In the Buddhist view, when you fall asleep, your senses stop functioning. This is also the Western scientific view. Except when you're dreaming, right, your mind is operating, and that's what creates the dream. And you have this whole narrative drama that's going on, which is the dream. In the Buddhist sense, what's happening is of the 6 sense organs, the 5 material sense organs are no longer functioning. They're in abeyance, but the mental sense organ is functioning. So all it's aware of is old memories and images and stuff like that. So it puts together a narrative. So in that sense, the Buddhist view of dreaming and the Western scientific view of dreaming are the same. Where it's different, though, is when you're asleep and you stop dreaming. In the Buddhist view, what's happened is your consciousness is still there. It's just there's no object to be in relationship to that consciousness because none of the 6 sense organs are functioning. So since there's no object to be in relationship to that consciousness, you're aware of nothing. Because in the Buddhist view, awareness has a continuity that never stops. Ever. It never stops. Well, I'm sorry, that's not true. There's one school of Buddhist thought that considers consciousness to be composed of momentary phenomena where there are flashes of not consciousness in between, like the flickering of a light. But there's other views, other Buddhist views, which is the stream of consciousness is a continuum, which is without beginning or end. And that's the reason you're reborn. But anyhow, the point in this context is that in deep dreamless sleep, you're aware of nothing. That's why you don't feel like you're aware of anything, because you're only used to the experience of awareness in relationship to an object. So it feels like what we in the West, modern West, call unconscious. That's the difference between the Buddhist view and the modern Western view. Although what's interesting is if you look at the electroencephalogram studies that are done in Western science, it's obvious that there's something going on in the brain anyway when you're in deep dreamless sleep. It's not like the brainwave activity has stopped. So why do they assert that there's no consciousness? Well, that gets into all kinds of problems about the relationship between brainwave activity and consciousness that we don't want to get into. But anyhow, that's the difference between the Buddhist and the Western views of what goes on in sleep. And the fact is that there is no such thing as unconsciousness. There's just consciousness of nothing, which is interesting because at the moment of death, everything in the material and the mental, and everything in the material body and in the mental functioning stops, except consciousness remains. So there's consciousness of nothing. It's called clear light mind. It's the fundamental nature of mind, or the fundamental nature of consciousness, which occurs at that particular moment of death, which lasts for a longer or shorter period of time. So now we're into the tantric teachings. We're beyond the 3 turnings of the wheel. Okay, probably more than you wanted to hear an answer to that. But.
No, and I have another question, but I don't want to, I want others to have an opportunity, but I've got a follow-up question.
Well, that's okay. I don't see anybody else having any questions. Does anybody else have any questions? So ask away. It seems like no one seems to be concerned about this. I don't see anybody raising a hand.
I am currently, for a friend, reading a version of just some passages out of the Book of the Dead. She died about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks now. And
condolences.
So I do know about the clear light of consciousness. That's in there, and I have a chitty chat with her about that. Now, the passage I'm reading, and I'm afraid I can't tell you which one it's from, talks about there being 2 aspects, that there's consciousness and there's intellect. Can you clarify for me the difference, what they're talking about? There's consciousness and then there's intellect.
I'd need to know what the Sanskrit terms are that they're referring
Radio.
to,
Yeah, I don't have that. Yeah.
or even maybe even the Tibetan terms. I mean, because I don't know what's meant by intellect in that context. I'm not an expert on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I haven't read it for a long time.
Mhm.
So I don't know what they mean by intellect. I mean, I could hazard a guess, but I'd be afraid to, especially in the context of this being really salient for you right now with
Yep.
your friend's death. I'm afraid I'd get it wrong, and that might lead you astray. So
Yeah.
I'm not gonna go there. I'm sorry, I can't.
Okay, related question
Sure.
to that then
Yeah.
is then there is reference in this to the Dharmakaya.
Sure.
Can you explain that in briefly? I know what I'm asking.
Okay. All right. So Dharmakaya literally means the Dharma body. And when I was talking about the 3 states of consciousness that we go through in the 24-hour cycle of dreamless sleep, dream, and waking consciousness, they're not usually, they can be taken as being similitudes or metaphors for what are called the 3 bodies of the Buddha, which are waking consciousness is like the Nirmanakaya, which is like the body of a Buddha that we can see. It literally means the emanation body, but it means the body of a Buddha that we can see. And then there is Sambhogakaya, which is like dreaming consciousness, which we ordinary people cannot see because it's like a mental body. It's like we can't see our thoughts. We have our thoughts, but we can't see our thoughts, so we can't see anybody else's thoughts. We might believe that we can see somebody thinking because they furrow their brow and they roll their eyes, and they scratch their head, and maybe they're talking and they sort of stop and there's a pause and then they go back to talking. We say they were thinking about what they were talking about, but we can't see the thoughts, right? There's no way to see the thoughts. So that's like the Sambhogakaya. That's like the body of a Buddha, which is not visible, but it's also similar. It's a similitude. It's like dreaming consciousness. And I'm going to come back to why this is relevant in some other ways in regards to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And then, I've been talking about dreamless sleep, which is awareness of nothing because none of the senses are functioning. That's like similitude to Dharmakaya. Dharmakaya is the awareness of the Buddha at the beginning of the Heart Sutra when he's in this profound state of meditation, which for us is awareness of nothing. For him, it's a bit different. But anyhow, the Dharmakaya is pure consciousness without an object, pure objectless consciousness, except it knows itself by certain ways of thinking in Buddhism. Not all Buddhists agree with this, but certain schools of Buddhist thought say that consciousness knows itself because its nature is cognition. The nature of consciousness is as clear, it's luminous, and it knows, right? So it knows itself. So that's the Dharmakaya. So in the context of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or in the context of any of us dying, at the moment of death, all physical and ordinary mental aspects of ourself have ceased, and all that remains is just the stream of consciousness without an object. So it's like Dharmakaya. That clear light of the moment of death is like Dharmakaya because it's consciousness without any object. And it's luminous, it's peaceful, it's beatific, it's aware only of itself. But is so subtle that we typically can't experience it. It just goes by and we don't even notice it's happening. Great yogis have a different experience of that. Once I spent a little time with, I think he was the 98th or 99th Ganden Tree Rinpoche. He stayed with us in our house in San Francisco. And I thought he was really pretty wonderful and cool and all that. Several years later, he died. And he spent, I think it was 29 days in the clear light. I mean, not an ordinary person at all. I had no idea. You know, an ordinary person might spend 3 days in the clear light and they don't even know they're there. But when the clear light ceases and consciousness actually departs the body, it enters an in-between state called the bardo. That's the meaning of bardo. It means between one life and another. Bardo just means in between. And in that state, the habit patterns, the imprints of our karma and experience, which are somehow imprinted on the consciousness itself, come forth. And the bardo is like a dream, like being in a dream state. But like dreams, it's usually not under our control and we don't know what's happening. And then there's various narratives of what happens in that state. And one of the narratives that happens is that we're driven by the desire to have a body, to be embodied. So we find another body and then we're reborn. And that's the condition of all beings in the cycle of life and death, that they go through this process endlessly until they're liberated. And one of the ways you get liberated, by the way, is perfecting shamatha so that you can understand the nature of consciousness and be free of these impulses, either in this normal world or in the bardo world, because you can actually function in this clear light space of consciousness rather than just not even recognizing that it's happening. So there's a long answer to your short question. Is that helpful?
Absolutely. And I'm having my chats in the morning outside in a beautiful area with my friend, hoping that she can stay in the clear light a little longer. I'm encouraging her.
Well, how long has she been dead?
2 weeks.
What happened to her? What happened to her body?
I don't even know. It will be cremated. I don't know if it already has happened or not. She's in California and I'm in South Australia, and friends are helping, but it's confusing, difficult
I can
times.
imagine it's confusing. I can imagine that the state has something to say about a body hanging around for 2 weeks.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, and I have worked in palliative care, and I have chatted with Buddha House over here, and trying to have people die at home and do things like there is a sort of a refrigeration mat you can use so that they can be at home longer.
Oh,
So yeah, there are a lot of things that can be done, but it's difficult. It's complicated. There are death doulas over here. That's what, I don't know if you've got that term over there. People who sort of help facilitate this. Good. Yep, yeah. I see a yes. Good,
yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, when my mother died, she was in a congregate care home and they weren't going to let her stay there. So I told the mortuary to keep her refrigerated for 4 days before she was cremated. That was legal. You could do that. But of course, they had to move her body, which is not ideal. But, that was a way of dealing with my trying to be respectful of the process for my mother. Because of the way she died, she probably exited long before 3 days were up. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult in this society. But, you can tell any mortuary, you pay extra, but they'll keep you chilled for 4 days for what it's worth. I think my wife's listening to this. Okay, we're at a little past an hour and a half. Well, no, we're at an hour and a half into the talk. Any more questions? Hopefully not. Good. Okay, I hope this was useful. As I said, I wanted to create some sort of context for what I've been doing here over the last few months and pull it into sort of one pattern so you can try and see it. So it's not a lot of disparate parts sort of hanging out there. That was the whole point of the image of the wheel, how everything connects to everything. And over the next couple of weeks, we'll focus more on the perfection of wisdom, the actual practice of understanding the emptiness of phenomena and consciousness itself, which is really what and I'll bring some scholarly stuff into this also. Hope I don't bore you with it. Okay. Good night. See you in a week.